In the wilds of southern Greece, olive groves crowd on pebble-strewn, earth, artifacts, and masonry of all eras nestled among the brambles and the orchards, alongside scrap metal and plastics like few other places in the world. This region of the Mediterranean has a glut of evidence from the ancient world too, not just settlement sites and outposts, but vast metropolises of the ancestors in abundance, the time when many of those settlements of antiquity surpassed modern towns in both size and relative splendor. One of those places, hidden up high on a little visited ridgeline in the south-central Peloponnese, is Nichoria, unlike so many others. In a wide arc from here all the way to the north side of the Black Sea and westwards to Italy, this sprawling site doesn't originate in the archaic or classical eras of Greek history of Athens and Sparta and Alexander the Great. Nichoria dates to a time before to the first Greece. For here are to be found a number of the lost tombs relics from the Mycenaean age of Homer's Odyssey and Jason's monster-ridden search for the Golden Fleece. A full-on, colossal citadels of the prehistoric world, Cyclopean masonry, and heavily armored, chariot-riding warrior lords, of elaborate palaces and intricately crafted technology, swords, feasting, and wine. Though little remains now above ground from that ancient time, to walk in the once mighty citadel here at Nichoria today is to gain a fleeting window into the heroic past, as always. I'm your host, Pete Kelly, and I bid you welcome to History Time. Soon, we'll embark on our journey across continents and distant oceans, some 3,300 years into the past. But first, a quick word from the sponsor of this video, who made this ridiculously time-consuming project possible back in the glory days of Mycenaean. Had the great lords of the Argolid simply sorted out their internet security, they may never have needed to go to war at Troy. If Agamemnon and Menelaus had only used Surfshark VPN, they would have been able to simply change their virtual location to the Troad, meaning they could access all the great TV shows streaming from Troy, as well as having their IP address there too, to reduce the risk of being censored and hacked, keeping their data safe from online pirates and sea peoples, brigands who could potentially access their data when stopping off and using Wi-Fi at an oracle or a temple, while Surfshark VPN would keep the movements of the Achaeans secret by not monitoring tracking or storing the High King's activities. It even also has a clean web feature which blocks ads trackers, malware, and phishing attempts. Don't be like a DCUs, getting lost for 10 years after the Trojan War. Secure your online data today by signing up for an account with Surfshark VPN. Now I've teamed up with Surfshark to offer you up to 6 months for free by using my code in the description below. They even offer a 30-day money-back guarantee. Thanks again to Surfshark VPN. Now back to the ancient world. When archaeologist Carl Blagjen set about digging up the ancient ruins of Pylos in 1939, the world watched on, in awe. Within weeks, astounding discoveries were made in the midst of an immensely impressive palatial complex dating to the 2nd millennium BC. An entire archive of records was unearthed, written in a mysterious text known as Linear B, by far the largest collection on the Greek mainland. It could only have been the long-lost library of an ancient European kingdom, known previously only in epic storytelling tradition and myth. Soon enough, the place was named for the wise king, said to have ruled in these parts in the days of the Trojan War, the long-disappeared world of the Iliad and the Odyssey, seeming to come back to life today, whether strictly historical or not. It still proudly bears that name. The Palace of Nestor. Though a golden age for archaeological research, the late 1930s was of course a time of immense societal turbulence and cataclysmic change, too. Within a matter of months of the first digs at Belos, the Axis powers moved their plans to fruition. Greece, falling within the orbit of fascist Italy, would doggedly fight for its independence for years to come. When Blaggan was finally able to return to Pylos to regroup with his Greek colleagues, like the aftermath of all wars, everything had changed for one thing. Radiocarbon dating, a byproduct of the ridiculously high budgets pumped into the war effort, was bringing archaeology in line with modern science for the first time, providing exact dates within around 50 years or so, where rough estimates had sufficed. Before, when it came to the very late prehistoric period, the heyday of Mycenaean Greece, and the previously only mythic Trojan War, the new dates were often shockingly accurate to the estimations of classical scholars unknown to Blaggan on the other side of the Atlantic. A New York scholar had been tirelessly working for decades on the Linear B tablets found on Crete as far back as the late 1800s by Sir Arthur Evans, though Alice Kober died. Before the work could fully be brought to fruition, her efforts and those of countless others would culminate in 1952, when Linear B was finally successfully translated, as it so often does. The breakthrough came from an outsider. Michael Ventris, an amateur codebreaker, had long had a hunch that Linear B was in fact Greek, in its very earliest archaic form, and that hunch turned out to be correct finally by the mid-1950s. For the first time in over 3,000 years, the words of that ancient land could be read, the stories they told, though usually consisting of minimal records rather than epic sagas, have nevertheless added near unfathomable amounts to our understanding of Bronze Age Greece, specifically revealing unique insights into the inner workings of one of its foremost kingdoms. Sprawling across the far southwestern province of Mycenaean in Homeric tradition, said to be the kingdom of Pylos, ruled over by wise old Nestor, second only to Agamemnon of Mycenae, in importance amidst the hundreds of tablets in the so-called archives complex. At the Palace of Nestor were found a number now known as the Coast Guard tablets, a unique list of the defences and settlements in the kingdom for administrative purposes, described as divided into two provinces, roughly translating as the hither or closer, and the far lands usually assumed to be oriented from Pylos, perhaps, as well as the recently discovered secondary capital centre at Eglina, not far away. The list begins at the northern portion of the hither or near province, running down and along the coast of the peninsula, ending with just one town in the far province. It is possible that the only settlements listed are those on the coast, or near enough to the coast to act as part of a seaborne defence system, perhaps explaining why most of the settlements in Pylos, unlike the Argilid and elsewhere, did not need fortification walls, their mastery over the coast being their defence, though no consensus exists today given the fragmentary nature of the sources and the sheer antiquity of their age. The hither or near province has nonetheless been widely hypothesized to lie west of the Egelion and Shala Mountains, with the far province and its shorter coastline situated within the hinterlands of the Mycenaean Valley. Just one town of the far province is named in the Coast Guard tablets. Not surprisingly, ever since their translation, Scholars hypothesized where that town could be translated as the rather indecipherable name Timo Tawa Kiyi. It was not the capital, but one of 7 principal towns, usually assumed to be a coastal site or near to the ancient coastline, at least as well as being close to the provincial border, with hopes of finding another archive like that. At Pylos, the search was on. Of the nearly 200 sites surveyed over the ensuing decades, just a handful of particularly large candidates were pinpointed as potential locations for Mycenaean towns or cities. One of those sites among the 10 largest in the whole of Messenia, and a place already highlighted by Ventress's colleague and Mycenaean expert John Chadwick, is Nichoria. Aside from the Tagotos Mountains rising in the haze to the east, the summit of Nichoria provides excellent visibility in all directions, a natural crossroads well placed for communication as well as defense. Only 2 kilometers to the south is the Mycenaean Gulf, just about visible today in a narrow coastal strip past a hilly expanse of olive groves. It is important to remember that shorelines shift and change over thousands of years. Here in ancient days, the waves would have lapped much closer than they do today. In the Pylos tablets, Timitoaki is said to have acted as a lookout station, one node in a vast coastal network. We can imagine runners heading off beacons being lit to send messages to the palace as soon as unwanted visitors were seen. They trade ships to be taxed or plundered. Attack from other Mycenaean palace lords or pirates. A little further north on the adjacent hill, prehistoric remains have been found, too tentatively identified as a lookout post for the city, perhaps to protect the exposed posterior side from surprise visits. With hopes of archives and immense discoveries, the archaeologists soon moved in. The team knew it was special as soon as they saw it poking out of the ground, deep hollow eyes staring back at them from the sun at Earth, not much wider than pinpricks when compared with some of the more famous finds of its kind, like the Lady of Philokapi and the multitudes of idols found at Mycenae. And yet, crude as it is, somehow primal, fearsome, even the so-called Dame of Nichoria does seem to reside within that well-known category of Mycenaean sculpture, most famously seen with the so-called idols of Mycenae itself, at just 0.67 meters high. It is a small piece, the lower part of the face, unfortunately having been chipped away at some point in the past, leaving behind the mystery of what this part of the face originally looked like, whether it had been round or long, and pointed like the so-called Lord of Asini. From the Paulos headdress the dame wears, it has been concluded to be female, perhaps like hypothesized examples from Minoan, Crete representing a cultic priestess. When the piece was first sculpted, it may well have stood up to an impressive 1/3 of a meter in height, though no evidence of paint has so far been found. Its gritty and coarse surface may simply have worn away over the millennia. Today, the Dame of Nichoria remains one of the most interesting pieces found at the site. Speaking of a very real apogee of Mycenaean occupation that took place here in the late Helladic III-B period, the 13th century BC, the supposed age of the Trojan War. By the time the intense 5-year program of large-scale digging, undertaken by the University of Minnesota under the direction of Professor William A. MacDonald, was completed in 1974. A number of fascinating breakthroughs had been made, thankfully for the archaeologists involved. Nichoria had indeed been a place of great significance, though Given the complicated layers of habitation and significant levels of erosion and damage over the millennia, the place remained frustratingly difficult to comprehend. From their first arrival in 1969 to the last trenches of 1974, a total area of 50,000 square meters would be dug. 6 strenuous campaigns of trench digging, meticulously covering an area of 5,000 square meters. And yet, though this may sound like a lot, it represented just 10% of the areas showing evidence of human habitation. As with all digs, priorities had to be made, choices taken in addition to the various pieces of Nichoria that was still privately owned, and thus out of bounds for digging. Only some of the trenches made it down to undisturbed soil, both due to time and straits, and as a result of the decision to not destroy later buildings to get down to the ever-mysterious Mycenaean levels gone, were the days of the destructive methods of Heinrich Schliemann, destroying everything else in his attempt to find what he was looking for. Nevertheless, even with these difficulties, the Mycenaean pottery pieces alone at Nichoria numbered over 800 small finds in general, more than 2,000 animal bones and sculpture fragments in particular, giving significant insights into burial customs, diet architecture, and even foreign contacts above all else, seeking evidence of Nichoria's relationship with the rest of the Pilar's kingdom. One of the most significant finds was the evidence of resident bronze smiths, like the Dame, dated by pottery fragments to the era of the Coast Guard tablets in the 13th century BC by the 1970s, though John Chadwick had ultimately changed his mind on Nichoria, surmising it not to be Timitawaki after all, but potentially another town in the southwest quadrant of the Near province. The importance of the place is a Pylian town. Matching descriptions in the tablets could not be denied, crucially, all being described as having bronze industries tied to the palace, with contributions being passed back and forth. The bronze working at Nichoria then provides a rare convergence of contemporary Mycenaean records and archaeology. Back in 1969, it had all begun when a test trench in the north and west of the site revealed Mycenaean foundations, and a great sigh of relief, though like most areas of the site, which continued to be intensively inhabited until well into the high medieval era, later ruins stood on top, obscuring much of the most ancient levels in this case. Mysterious geometric structures from the end of the Dark Age, following the Mycenaean period, and yet even so, Enish streets from that late Bronze Age city were ultimately uncovered, especially on its southern side, where curving terrace walls gave tantalizing hints to the majesty of the place. In ancient days, on that southern side, running along and over the edge of the hill, another wall was found running from the northeast to the west, southwest quadrant, which may also be of Mycenaean date, though this particularly intriguing section was unable to be excavated fully. It has been hypothesized to house the deeply buried remnants of a grand gated entranceway, perhaps not worlds away from the famous examples of Mycenaean tyrants on the western side. In a section known as Area 5, a number of important finds were made in that part of the hill, thought to have once formed a natural gully or hollow centuries of ploughing and vine farming, but unfortunately caused severe destruction. Nevertheless, a great deal of material was uncovered, including corner molds for creating intricate jewelry of interlocking ivy leaf bands, and the Dame of Nichoria. In addition to the bronze working area in Unit 3 and 4, actual bronze goods and other crafted items were found. For example, well over 200 spindle whorls were collected dating all the way from the Middle Atlantic to the so-called Dark Age, following Mycenaean times, notably on a rubbish dump. One large figurine body, dating to the early days of Mycenaean settlement, was found, the head unfortunately missing. Though animal figurines are fairly common at Mycenaean sites, generally assumed to be idols, perhaps representing deities, larger ones are much more rarely found. Notably, a sizable fragment of an animal figurine was found at Nichoria, thought to be a pig, originally standing at around 7 meters up to its neck, larger when it had a head. It's not the most impressive example ever found, but it does put Nichoria within the mainstream of late Bronze Age society at the time. Not far away was also found a small horse's head, not unlike those found at Mycenae, and published by Angela Tamvaki. And yet, for those searching for the lost city of the archival records, a single potsherd provided the most tantalizing evidence of all, suggesting the existence of a literate elite, for it bore an inscription in Linear B. But what of the layout of the settlement? Where did the people live, and what can the archaeology tell us about their lives? Well, unfortunately, the area has suffered so much from erosion and looting over the years that stratified information is patchy at best. Rather than a detailed plan, we have an immensely complicated series of habitations obscuring Mycenaean foundations, and when those buildings can be seen, they are a far cry from the glittering palatial centres at the heart of the Pylos polity, in comparison to the Palace of Nestor and the multi-storied complex at Eklena. They have been called crude and provincial. The final reports from the Minnesota expedition, for example, stated with certainty that no building prior to the Byzantine era had been roofed with terracotta tiles, a luxury style that elsewhere had been seen as early as the 3rd millennium BC with sites like Lerna. In the more affluent Argilid Nichoria did not seem to follow the conventions of the more distant capitals, perhaps the elites. Here simply didn't need to invest their wealth in such flamboyant displays of power, towering over the surrounding hill and plains. People outside their walls anyway. But what of that elite? As usual for them, we have some of the best evidence of all seen, most obviously in the mighty dramas and follows tombs that survive largely intact to the present. One in particular at Nichoria, intricately built from limestone, likely used by the ruling dynasty, ranks among the largest and most impressive in all the Mycenaean world. When cleared in 1971 and fully excavated down to its original base level in the next years, as expected, most of the tomb's contents were long gone. Various fragments of ivory and bronze shards, just giving hints of what had once been interred. The one constant in archaeology often being near total disappearance to oblivion. Far from a modern occurrence, the initial opening and looting of the tombs took place as early as the end of the Mycenaean era by the 4th century BC. They had become places of veneration once more, just as they likely were. At the time of their construction, places to visit the venerated ancestors, real or imagined, clearly still prominent structures, like many other follows and chambered tombs in Messenia, becoming cultic centres, harking back to an age of heroes of long ago elsewhere on the site. A great deal of so-called Dark Age evidence, dated tentatively to around 1050 to 975 BC, is regularly found among the scree and the rubble, including coiled bronze rings, earrings, and an elaborate pin. A good deal more evidence than at many Mycenaean sites, suggesting some sort of continued habitation. The possibility of a collapse here, just like at the palatial census, has been suggested with evidence of possible burning. Though This is far from definitive. What the evidence does definitively show is that after the so-called Dark Age came the geometric period, an equally mysterious time, before even Archaic era Greece. During that time, a much reduced Iron Age village would develop in the section of the site known as Area 4, given the evidence from the digs, from the cemeteries, the buildings and the material goods. There is no question of the reuse of the Acropolis in the era after the Mycenaean apogee, after about the 11th century BC, often in a much reduced state. Perhaps after an intermission of 100 years, though we can't say for sure. But what of the beginning of Nichoria? How did it develop? And how did it become part of the kingdom of Pylos? When people first came to Nichoria, long before the fences and the cultivated olive groves, it looked very different to today when those early farmer ancestors of the late Stone Age arrived. The place was still a prominent feature, of course, though not yet shaped by the hands of humanity. Portions of the cliff's edge and hillside ultimately having been cut down and moulded over the ages. Forests coated the land in those days of gnarled oak, pistachio and others. And though largely invisible now from an archaeological perspective, high places provided good vantage points for settlements, but most alien of all, visible in geological features, indicative of coastal erosion on the base of the cliffs, the sea likely lapped at the hill's edge. Only in relatively recent centuries would the sandy coastal plain we see today begin to form. So, when the revolutionary concept of metalworking first appeared in Greece at the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC, seeming to go hand in hand with elites. Since the very beginning, coastal trading routes became integral to the power of rulers in the increasingly socially stratified society of the Bronze Age. Nichoria, with its ready-made defenses and adjacency to the sea roads, must have seemed a perfect location. And unsurprisingly, a small autonomous community began to coalesce. Archaeologist Philip Rapp goes so far as to suggest an archaic lagoon once extended well into the valley mouth of the Caris River, providing not just shelter from storms, but good landing sites for small prehistoric vessels until it dried up in the Roman era. The precise location of the harbour at Nichoria, however, remains a mystery, no digs as of yet having confirmed a location in the ever-changing landscape given the apparent coastal nature of the site. It comes as little surprise, then, that some of the most impressive remains from the early layers seem to have originated, at least in influence, from elsewhere, for in the later part of the Middle Hlatic phase, in terms of pottery styles, there is a great deal of similarity with Minoan Crete, that famed island of palace builders and seafarers, spoken of by the classical historian Thucydides as the first great sea power, or thalassocracy of the Aegean, not far to the south, in myth, ruled over by King Minos. The builder of the labyrinth Archaeology 2 suggests a very real flourishing in the Middle Bronze Age, likely influenced a great deal by the power of ancient Egypt. They, in turn, likely had a marked effect on the people to their north and west along shorelines, as far north as Troy. In those days, the archaeology at Nichoria suggests a modest scattering of families spread widely over the ridge. A largely self-contained community with evidence of metallurgy, and though cultural influence from Crete can be seen, no doubt trade links fostered with one or more of the palatial centers of the island, no evidence of political or economic domination can be seen. No burials are found either, which matches with Crete itself. For that period, sky burials or sea burials, hypothesized as means of disposing of the dead, suggesting the culture of Crete may have been somewhat contagious, with the exception of Malthi. Nichoria remains one of the only prehistoric settlements in the southwestern Peloponnese to be investigated in depth. These two local centers seeming to have played similar roles throughout the Middle and Late Helladic periods, ultimately sharing the same fate of the wider political events of the Aegean. For by the 16th century BCE, major change was on the way. In the 16th century BC, the island of Santorini exploded, obliterating habitation on the island and launching tidal waves and dust clouds across the sea. Such was the power of the destruction and resulting tidal waves. The pumice from the eruption can actually be seen at Nichoria, much closer to the eruption zone. However, was Crete a century of chaos ensued and the forging of an entirely new system to the north? Meanwhile, in the Argolid of mainland Greece and neighboring Attica and Boeotia, in bays and inlets, sheltered from the shockwave. From Ferra, the various ships and war vessels of the mainland, previously a rather provincial culture, would move out and forge the world anew soon enough. Crete and the rest of the Aegean would be Mycenaean. Nichoria was no exception, like a history of the Mycenaean world in miniature. A gradual shift being visible in the archaeology as well, a significant population growth. The place seeming to be the center of an emerging political and social unit of considerable complexity. In the late Helladic I and II eras, very much in the mainstream of the Mycenaean world, one of the main pieces of evidence for this is from the cemeteries dating to the very earliest days of the later Helladic, continuing throughout the Mycenaean age, for unlike the previous eras, the great lords and ladies of Nichoria were now laid to rest in mighty tombs that are still visible today throughout the last 200 years of a scholarship on the Mycenaean world, ever since the Halcyon days of Schliemann and Suntus. A great deal of emphasis has been placed on Pholos and Drama's tombs as concrete evidence of so-called royal dynasties. After all, those early researchers reasoned, who else but kings and queens could afford such edifices? And yet in reality, besides the immensely wealthy grave goods, compared to other graves of the time outside of Homer's catalogue of ships, which talks at length of petty kingdom, though actually written down, hundreds of years later, very little corroborating evidence exists. The massive tomb of Angelica on Mykonos, for example, now languishing as a rubbish dump for a mostly oblivious hotel, though, once the greatest in all the Cyclades, does not seem to correspond with a nearby city or center of any known kingdom likewise. We do not in actuality know whether the early so-called kings and queens of Nichoria actually controlled the surrounding territories or even villages lying much beyond the orbit of the settlement. It begs the question whether these were actually royal dynasties at all, or if a multitude of ways of governing could have been in use like proto-policies of the later classical age, though it seems likely that exploitation of land resources in the immediate areas would have been intensive, along with considerable trade coming and going by land and sea. Without written records, it remains difficult to know whether a policy existed solely on the Acropolis itself or extending outwards to the surrounding area, though clues can be gained from neighboring sites just 2.5 km away at the village of Daphne. Another Thalos tomb is to be found, along with possible indications of an adjacent Mycenaean settlement. Should we be imagining a fully autonomous neighboring dynasty within 3 kilometers of Nichoria, or should alternate hypotheses be sought for? Thalos tombs, a cadet branch, perhaps like those that have been suggested for Terrans, Medea, and Mycenae itself, or even a ruling family of favorite courtiers designated as princes to supervise villages and towns not quite fully independent politically, but following the burial customs of the capital as best they could. And finally, we have the question of just when, how, and even if Nichoria was subsumed into the larger Pylos polity. What we do know is that by the 14th century BCE, the apogee of the site was ushered in the quality and quantity of the finds from the Thalos tomb, even with the place having been looted. Show prosperity reaching a peak, whether the rulers interred, they were put in place by Pylos or not, lasting into the 13th century BC apparently without a break. We can't say. As for the palace hoped for by archaeologists, though nothing concrete has been found thus far during the late Helladic III period, there are indications that something akin to one may have once existed in the central saddle of the southeastern side of the ridge, in the location known as Area 4, a heavily eroded late Helladic III complex has been suggested as the administrative center of the site. Perhaps once independent, later ruled over by a provincial governor reporting back to Pelos, just like Homer says in the Iliad, then the possibility exists of a dynasty of vassal kings ruled over by an overking themselves, in turn ruling over even smaller units, though whether this distinction was one that even mattered to most inhabitants, we can't say, life possibly going on much as it had before. And as for the governor of the city, amazingly, if the place was indeed Temito-Aki, the Coast Guard tablets give us his name. When I visited Nichoria in the late summer of 2022, a great deal had changed since the days of the Minnesota expedition. Those excavators unknowingly having stood near the end of the so-called golden age of archaeology for wants of funding and inclination, large-scale excavations of sites like this one, a rare now reinterpretation of existing information, and small-scale digs having become the norm for many reasons to visit today, is to step back in time. And though a few individuals did come through during our brief time on the ridge, far from the usual hordes of tourists filling the major sites like Mycenaean Athens, we mostly had the place to ourselves. There is no entrance fee, no visitors center, and no gift shop. Few fences to block off out-of-bounds areas, and for precisely these reasons, visiting Nichoria was one of the most memorable experiences of the entire trip. So it was then, on a sleepy morning, on the road from Naplion to Pylos, we made our stop, as far as I could tell. Some 50 years had passed since the place had been dug, the still visible trenches and exposed foundations having become overgrown over the years, dangerous even to unsuspecting passers-by, with few information boards and only scattered fragments to be found. Online sites like these demand an imagination. Besides the Thanos tombs, there are few visible remnants, but that's precisely why I love the place. For someone used to British hill forts and Neolithic settlements, imagination is often all we have: cyclopean wall or ridgeline, ancient citadel or patch of earth. It isn't easy to tell, but in order to do so, thankfully we can turn to the records of the digs themselves. And in the late 60s, when the team from Minnesota began digging here, almost immediately they found the place to have been a flourishing settlement. Though, as we have already seen, one of their great desires remained to find an archive of Linear B tablets, like those found at Pylos, dating to the late Helladic III B period, the late 13th century BC tablets, that document an extensive and well-organized bureaucratic system, a snapshot of a kingdom stretching north to the Neda River and along the coast to Kalamata, indisputably administered from the palace at Pylos, fired, fused, and saved from oblivion entirely unintentionally when the place was destroyed by fire around 1200 BC. Unfortunately, after some 40 weeks of systematic digging, no archive was found, nor even a conclusive palatial centre or administrative hub. A mere single potsherd, bearing a possible mark of Linear B, being the only evidence that anyone at Nichoria had been literate at all. Nevertheless, when utilising the Pylos tablets, alongside the archaeological data, we can glean a great deal of information, not only on how Nichoria functioned, but how it was likely to have been governed too, even if its identification as Timitoaki is incorrect. For the tablets give the mayor of Timitoaki, at the time of the destruction of Pylos, a name, an extremely rare figure coming alive from those ancient records. His name was Perimos, and even if Nichoria was a different site, surely it too had a Paramos of its own. What happened to Paramos, or what if the mayor of Nichoria had been called at the time of the end of the kingdom, remains completely unknown, as does the manner of its destruction and who precisely carried it out. The violent of evils at the end of the Bronze Age, remaining one of the great mysteries in world history, with outside invasion and domestic revolution being equally suggested. It's even possible that our mayor was one of the leaders of the attack on Nestor's palace, throwing off the shackles of distant rule in a time of change, for Nichoria may well have survived the end of the Bronze Age, at least for a time. But what of Perimo before that fateful destruction? And what can the tablets tell us of Nichoria at the very apogee before the fall, up until the cataclysmic change that brought the palatial centres of the Aegean to their knees by the 12th century BC? The resource that kept the world moving was bronze in that time. Before currency, as we would recognize it, and when the vast majority of people had no access to metal of any kind, that alloy of tin and copper was utilized primarily to forge instruments of power, weapons of war, beautiful craft items, and the gifts of kings. Whilst copper was rare, being found only in a handful of locations, tin was virtually non-existent. Those who could gain access to the megatrickles coming in from what is now Afghanistan, and perhaps a few other places, could become extravagantly rich. And though we don't know enough about Bronze Age trade to definitively talk of monopolists, it does seem that in the Aegean, the tin trade was linked above all else with the central authorities of the palatial centres in Mycenaean in particular. The Pylos tablets speak of bronze imports being allocated to each town and regional capital in melted down lump sums, to then be reworked by the various regional metalsmiths as they saw fit. Fascinatingly, at Nichoria, chemical analysis does indeed suggest most of the metalwork to have originated from reworked bronze rather than alloys of raw tin and copper. Chemical analysis also indicates the bronze to be extremely low in tin, perhaps the rarest and most sought-after resource in the world at the time, and one clearly not given up lightly by the kings at Pylos. The bronze at Nichoria is so low in tin, in fact, that it almost can't be called tin bronze. And of course, in return for that bronze that marked the elite at Nichoria as different, such regional towns, no doubt, provided a range of services for the palace centre at Pylos in return for protection. No doubt they paid their taxes. And in a pre-monetary system, this came in the form of goods. And when the need arose, military service indeed. The very reason why the concept of literacy was forged in the first place was to record such transactions and tributes, and Linear B is no exception. The surviving tablets, mostly recording economic information, and within the Pylos tablets in particular, we are told of the productivity of the various settlements of the kingdom. No doubt, due to the capital brought in for their lucrative woolen coats, sheep were by far the most common animal recorded on the tablets. Other animals recorded are pigs and a few cows used primarily for their heights, though in the archaeological record, cattle are extremely rare. Goats are not mentioned in the tablets, are the most common of all, used primarily for their milk and meat as sustenance rather than for export to the palace. Besides animal produce, among the other goods of the utmost importance to the palace economy was flax. Nichoria, sited on one of the most heavily watered places in an exceptionally fertile province, with no fewer than 5 major rivers and broad coastal plains, was perfect for the growing of these products. Today, the region still produces half of the flax grown in Greece, with a convenient land route also existing to the Pylos heartlands to the west, where raw flax could be sent on to the palace in return for his aid in bringing tribute to his overlord. Paramos was likely a very rich man, and if the Thalos tomb at Nichoria did indeed contain the remains of the leaders of the site, the bones and the skull fragments of between 10 and 17 individuals having been found in all Perimos, may well have been laid to rest among them, tiny fragments left behind by grave robbers, giving hints of the bronze vessels, sealstones, and other riches deposited with them. For the next world artifacts that clearly placed Nichoria very much in the mainstream of Mycenaean society, far from a backwater, as once assumed pottery fragments. 2. Demonstrate a few imports from the Aklot, and even Mycenae itself, and in one particularly well-preserved area, the buildings line up neatly along the remains of a well-planned cobblestone street. So then, though we may have discovered where Paramos's life came to an end, and there is of course no reason to assume that a palatial complex would even be recognizable here, in the same way as they are at Pylos, Tiryns, Mycenae, or Thebes. One last question remains. Where did our governor reside in life at both edges of the ridge? Slightly raised up areas, acropolises, within the Acropolis have long been hypothesized as potential locations for the administrative heart of the city, homes of the rulers of Nichoria, or even a lost palace. One of the sites, though damaged extensively over the millennia, revealed no evidence of Bronze Age habitation at all, the northwest edge. However, though also having suffered extensive damage over the millennia, did reveal evidence of Mycenaean buildings, though only fragments having survived. If an administrative archive had ever existed here without clear evidence of a conflagration at the end of Nichoria's Bronze Age, the sun. Dried tablets would have simply been scattered and disintegrated back to the earth. Paradoxically, it is only destruction that saves such records from oblivion. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then hit that subscribe button for much more of the same.